Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. Tonight's meeting was supposed to be a rare moment of respite, a chance to connect as individuals, rather than as diplomats locked in the complex dance of negotiations. Thomas had been looking forward to the evening's quiet, even though the weight of tomorrow's talks loomed over him like a storm cloud. He adjusted the cuffs of his formal jacket, the tailored fabric pulling slightly across his muscular frame as he leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a brief moment of relaxation. His dark eyes scanned Myra's face, taking in the subtle expressions that flickered across her features. Her emerald gaze seemed to study him with the same precision she likely reserved for political adversaries. There was an unreadable quality to her expression, save for the faintest smirk that tugged at the corner of her full lips. "You seem distracted," Myra said, her voice smooth, but laced with a sharp edge that Thomas had come to recognize. It was the tone she used when she was probing for something, trying to gauge the truth in someone's words. Thomas met her gaze without hesitation, refusing to be intimidated. "Just thinking about the stakes of tomorrow's talks," he replied evenly, his tone calm but not without a hint of warmth. "A treaty like this could change everything for both of our worlds?" Myra's eyes glimmered as she picked up the goblet of pale liquid that had been set before her. She swirled it in her hand, watching the light dance through the glass before meeting his eyes again. "Indeed," she murmured, her voice cool but contemplative. "But alliances are rarely built on logic alone. Trust is more vital than any trade agreement." Thomas let her words hang in the air for a moment before reaching for the ornate crystal corf that sat between them. It was the symbol of his people's ceremonial drink, and he felt the weight of its significance as he poured the sparkling liquid into his goblet. He held it up toward her, offering a gesture of both respect and goodwill. "Here's to trust," he said, his voice steady. "May it prove less elusive than we fear." Her eyes flickered to the goblet he extended toward her, and something in her expression shifted. The smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter stillness. For a moment, it was as if the air itself had stopped moving, as though the world had narrowed down to nothing but the simple gesture of his outstretched hand. Thomas, sensing a change, held his breath for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Myra's gaze never left his as she took a step closer. "Thomas," she said, her voice softer now but more intense. "Do you know what you are doing?" He froze, goblet still in hand, confusion settling over him like a thick fog. "Offering you a drink," he said, his tone uncertain now. Her pupils widened, her emerald irises almost glowing in the moonlight. "In the manner you just did," she pressed, her voice taking on a warning edge. Thomas swallowed, his earlier confidence fading. "I'm trying to be polite," he offered, but the words came out more as a question than a statement. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged, and then, with deliberate motion, Myra set her goblet down on the table. Her fingers brushed the rim, but the gesture felt final. "You have initiated the Sakara," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. "The Sakara? What is that?" Myra stepped closer to him, her movements swift and precise, until she was inches away from his chest. The space between them felt charged with tension. "The Sakara," she said, her voice almost a whisper now, "is an ancient ritual among my people. A bond of potential. And you have declared it publicly?" "I think there's been some kind of mistake," Thomas said quickly, taking a small step back. He could feel the cold weight of confusion pressing in on him. "I didn't mean to." "It does not matter what you meant," Myra interrupted, her gaze cutting into him like a blade. "Intentions are irrelevant in matters of the Sakara. Once begun, it must be completed." Thomas exhaled sharply, trying to make sense of her words, but the situation felt like it was spiraling beyond his control. "And how exactly does it get completed?" he asked, his voice steady despite the panic beginning to stir in his chest. Her expression hardened, and for the first time, Thomas saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath her fiery exterior. "By proving your worth," she said, each word laced with gravity. Thomas tilted his head, a half-smile forming despite the tension of the moment. "I thought I already proved that by getting the High Council to this negotiating table." "This is not a diplomatic test, Thomas," Myra replied, her tone serious as she stepped even closer. "It is personal." Thomas's stomach dropped as the realization began to hit him. This wasn't just about trade agreements or negotiations. The Sakara was a deeply personal and cultural ritual that was far more complex than any treaty. Myra's voice lowered. "The Sakara demands that you and I undergo a series of trials, emotional, physical, and psychological. Only by enduring them together can the bond be severed or solidified. He felt the weight of her words, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice calm despite the sudden realization that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze flickering with something unreadable. "If you fail, it will disgrace us both. The Council will see it as a breach of our sacred customs, and the alliance we've worked so hard to build will crumble before it even begins." Thomas's mind raced, but he held himself together. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a diplomatic disaster waiting to happen. "So, what you're saying," he began carefully, "is that I've accidentally initiated a courtship ritual with you?" Myra's gaze didn't waver. "Essentially." Despite the gravity of the situation, Thomas couldn't help but let out a low chuckle. "Well, that's certainly a first for me." Myra's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing. "You think this is amusing?" "No," he said quickly, sobering immediately. "But let's be honest, of all the ways this mission could go sideways, I didn't expect it to involve an alien mating ritual." Her sharp, humorless laugh cut through the tension. "Trust me, neither did I." For a moment they stood there, two figures from entirely different worlds, caught in a web of tradition neither fully understood. It was a strange mix of tension and amusement, and Thomas couldn't help but wonder how he had gotten himself into this situation. "All right," he said, his voice firm now, as though he had made his decision. "Then we'll see if you're truly as strong as you claim." Myra's lips curved into a small, reluctant smile. "You'll need to be stronger than you've ever been." With that, she turned on her heel, her dark hair swaying with the movement. She moved toward the archway that led back into the main compound. "Rest well, Thomas," she called over her shoulder, her voice cool but with an edge of something darker. "The first trial begins at dawn." As she disappeared into the shadows, Thomas stood alone under the moonlight. The cool night air pricked at his skin, but his thoughts burned with the weight of what lay ahead. He had no idea what trials the Sakara would spring on him, but the dawn was coming, and with it, the beginning of a challenge unlike anything he had faced before. The first trial was deceptively simple in its premise: cooperation under pressure. However, as Thomas followed Myra's gaze, he quickly realized that the true nature of the challenge was far more complex than he had anticipated. The arena before them was filled with tension, and the crowd's murmurs only amplified his rising unease. Around the central ring, several figures were preparing for the trial, carrying implements that ranged from long poles and strange nets to blunt-tipped weapons that gleamed under the early morning sun. Thomas furrowed his brow as he took in the sight. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked, hoping Myra might offer some clarity before the trial began in earnest. Myra glanced at him, her expression sharp, her voice clipped as she replied, "It means we work together to achieve a common goal. In this case, avoiding humiliation." There was little humor in her tone, only a blunt sense of urgency. Thomas knew from their brief exchanges that Myra wasn't one to sugarcoat things, and this was no exception. He swallowed, trying to prepare himself for whatever was coming next. Before he could press her further, a booming voice echoed across the amphitheater, commanding attention. "The participants will enter the arena." The sound was like a thunderclap, and the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the participants as they descended the stone steps into the ring. Thomas followed Myra, the noise of the crowd growing louder with each step. He glanced around, noting the faces of the onlookers. Most were Ain, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and expectation. When they reached the center of the arena, a figure stepped forward, a towering Ain male with deep blue skin and piercing silver eyes. His armor gleamed in the morning light, and he carried a ceremonial staff that thudded against the ground with every step. "Participants," the announcer's voice rang out again, deep and authoritative. "You will face the Croc, a test of unity and instinct. Your task is to subdue the trial beast and secure its crest. Only by working in harmony can this be achieved." Thomas raised an eyebrow, his pulse quickening. "Trial beast? That doesn't sound promising," he muttered under his breath. He glanced sideways at Myra, expecting some kind of explanation, but her focus was entirely on the large gated enclosure at the far end of the arena. She said nothing, but Thomas could feel the tension in the air as the gates creaked open. A collective hush fell over the crowd, and for the first time, Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine. The beast that emerged from the enclosure was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a massive four-legged creature, its sinewy muscles rippling under its midnight blue hide. Its glowing amber eyes scanned the arena with cold intelligence, and rows of sharp teeth glinted in the sunlight as it let out a guttural growl that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand on end. "Of course," Thomas muttered, trying to maintain his composure. It couldn't just be a written exam. No, it had to be something far more visceral. The announcer's voice rang out again, carrying across the arena. "Begin." With a roar, the beast wasted no time. It charged toward them with terrifying speed, its claws raking the stone floor, sending sparks flying. Thomas barely had a moment to react before Myra grabbed his arm, yanking him out of the way just in time to avoid the creature's lethal swipe. "Stay close," she hissed, her eyes flashing with urgency. "If we're separated, we're dead." "Noted," Thomas replied, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he fought to keep his nerves under control. This wasn't what he had expected. His heart raced, his mind struggling to process the chaos unfolding before him. Myra, however, was already in motion. She darted toward a rack of tools at the edge of the arena, grabbing a long pole tipped with what looked like a hook. "Distract it," she shouted over her shoulder as she hefted the pole, her tone commanding. "Distract it?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising with confusion. "How exactly?" "Be creative," she called back, her voice strained with focus. The beast's glowing eyes turned toward Thomas, its gaze fixed on him with unnerving precision. A surge of adrenaline shot through him as he grabbed a nearby net, its edges weighted with what looked like heavy stones. He circled around the creature, waving the net in the air and calling out, "Hey, ugly! Over here!" The beast snarled, its fangs bared, and in a split second, it lunged at him with lightning speed. Its claws tore into the ground where he had been standing only a moment before. Thomas dove to the side, his body hitting the ground with a painful thud. He rolled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, just as Myra rushed in from behind him. With swift, calculated motion, she hooked the pole onto one of the creature's horns and yanked hard, forcing the beast to stumble slightly. "Now," she called out. Thomas threw the net with all his strength, watching as the weighted edges tangled around the beast's legs, momentarily pinning it in place. The creature let out a deafening roar, its muscles straining against the entanglement. "Hold it steady," Myra commanded, her voice strained as she fought to keep her grip on the pole. "I can't hold it much longer." Easier said than done, Thomas thought, his arms screaming with effort. He dug his heels into the ground, summoning every ounce of strength he had as the beast thrashed beneath him. The muscles in his arms burned as he fought to maintain his hold on the net, each movement threatening to drag him off his feet. The ground beneath him felt as if it might give way at any moment, but he held firm, his focus entirely on the creature before him. In a sudden burst of agility, Myra climbed onto the creature's back, her movements fluid and precise. Thomas blinked, momentarily stunned by her speed. She reached for the crest, a jagged, crystalline growth at the base of the creature's neck, and with a decisive twist she snapped it off. The beast let out a final, deafening roar before collapsing onto its side, subdued at last. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the arena, and Thomas exhaled in relief. He released the net with a shaky breath, his body trembling from the exertion. "Well," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "that was invigorating." Myra shot him a look that was equal parts exasperated and amused. "You barely held on," she remarked dryly. "But I did hold on," he countered, a grin tugging at his lips despite himself. Myra shook her head, but there was a faint hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth before she turned away. The announcer stepped forward, his booming voice cutting through the cheers. "The first trial is complete. The bond between these two grows stronger," the announcer declared, his tone filled with an almost ceremonial weight. Thomas glanced at Myra, who met his gaze with an expression that was impossible to read. Was it respect? Curiosity? Annoyance? He couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. One thing was for certain. This was only the beginning. She gestured for him to follow her as they exited the arena. Her stride was purposeful, brisk, as though she had already moved past the events of the trial. "You're stronger than you look," Myra remarked, her tone clipped but not entirely unappreciative. "But you're reckless." "Reckless?" Thomas repeated, brushing dust from his jacket. "I'd call it improvisation." Myra's eyes flicked toward him, one eyebrow raised in an almost imperceptible challenge. "Improvisation gets people killed in the Sakara. You survived today because of luck. That won't be enough for the next trial." Thomas, his frustration mounting, crossed his arms. "Then maybe you could tell me what to expect ahead of time," he suggested, his tone edged with impatience. "You know, teamwork and all that." Myra stopped abruptly, spinning on her heel to face him. They were alone now, the muted hum of the crowd fading into the distance. The intensity of her gaze was palpable, and Thomas found himself momentarily speechless. "The Sakara is not a game, Thomas," she said, her voice low but firm. "It is a trial of instincts, of trust. If you can't learn to anticipate my moves, to act without hesitation, we will fail." For a long moment Thomas said nothing. The weight of her words settled over him, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Finally he nodded, his voice steady. "All right," he said. "Then teach me." For a brief second she seemed taken aback by his straightforwardness. Then a small, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she said. Before Thomas could reply, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor, a tall Ain clad in ceremonial robes of deep crimson. "Advisor Myra," the figure said, his tone formal but cool, "and the human diplomat. I trust the first trial was enlightening?" Counselor von Myra replied stiffly, her posture tightening. "To what do we owe this honor?" Vonk's gaze lingered on Thomas, his expression unreadable. The figure who had approached them in the corridor, Vonk, stood with an inscrutable expression, his eyes cold and calculating. He was one of the High Council's most traditional members, and Myra had clearly been expecting him. His presence here in this moment was no accident. He had come to remind them of something, a warning perhaps, or a challenge. His tone, formal yet laced with almost imperceptible malice, seemed calculated to unsettle them. "I merely wish to remind you both," he began, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, "that the Sakara is not merely a test of skill. It is a test of truth. The bond it forges cannot be built on half measures or deception." Myra didn't flinch. "We are aware," she said curtly, cutting him off. There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation. It was clear that she had encountered Vonk before and knew exactly how to deal with him. She stood her ground, her posture unwavering. "Now, if you'll excuse us," she added, dismissing him as though his presence no longer mattered. But Vonk, as if sensing the dismissal, pressed further, his voice thick with condescension and something darker. "I wonder," he began, his gaze moving from Myra to Thomas, the weight of his words hanging in the air, "if the human truly understands the weight of what he has begun." His eyes glinted silver, sharp like a predator's gaze. "Do you, Thomas?" Thomas met his gaze with a steady resolve, refusing to be intimidated. He had faced much worse in his life than this councilman, and he would not cower now. "I understand enough to know that failing isn't an option," he said, his voice steady despite the unease curling in his stomach. He wasn't sure if he believed those words entirely, but in that moment they rang true. Failing wasn't an option. Not for him, not for Myra, and not for whatever strange bond they had begun to forge in this brutal trial. Vonk's silver eyes narrowed slightly, as if Thomas had said something unexpected. There was a brief, pregnant pause before Vonk simply nodded, as though satisfied with the exchange, or perhaps dismissing it. With a small bow, he turned on his heel, his crimson robes swishing around him like a living thing. Without another word, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a sense of coldness that lingered in the air long after his departure. "Charming guy," Thomas muttered under his breath, watching the place where Vonk had vanished. He wasn't one for authority figures, especially ones that made him feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. Myra didn't respond immediately. "Vonk is one of the High Council's most traditional members," she explained, her voice flat but tinged with an edge of something like disdain. "He sees the Sakara as sacred. To him, it is an ancient right, something that must be preserved at all costs. He looks for any excuse to call us unworthy." Thomas raised an eyebrow, glancing at her. "And he's going to keep doing that until we prove him wrong, isn't he?" Myra's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, though it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. She didn't say anything, but the silence between them spoke volumes. She didn't deny it, and he didn't need her to. As they continued down the corridor, Thomas found himself growing more and more curious about the trials ahead. They had faced the first one, cooperation under pressure, and though he had survived, he knew this was only the beginning. He wondered what else Myra had in store for him, what other lessons she would impart about the Sakara and its demands. They soon reached their destination, a circular chamber bathed in the soft glow of bioluminescent orbs. The atmosphere here was different from the arena, more intimate and far quieter. The air was cooler, heavy with a sense of anticipation. Thomas could feel it in his chest, like a pulse that had yet to settle. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on the two pedestals at the center. Each pedestal held a thin, dagger-like blade, its surface etched with intricate runes that seemed to shimmer in the low light. "What now?" he asked, his voice slightly strained from the tension of the previous encounter. Myra stepped forward, her gaze steady as she gestured toward the blades. The second trial, she said, her voice calm and even. It is a test of vulnerability? Thomas frowned, confused. Vulnerability with daggers? His tone was incredulous, as though he hadn't quite understood her words. She picked up one of the blades, turning it in her hand so that the edge glinted in the light. The Sakara is not just about trust in action, she explained, her voice cool and steady. It is about trust and surrender. Her gaze met his, green eyes unflinching. We must wound each other. Thomas blinked, certain that he had misheard. You can't be serious. The blades are ceremonial, Myra said, her tone soothing yet firm. The wounds they inflict are symbolic. But the act itself is not. Her eyes never left his as she spoke, as though testing his resolve. You must bare your throat to me, Thomas, as I will to you. He stared at her, disbelief rising in his chest. And if I don't? The ritual will end, she replied simply, her voice unyielding. And with it, any chance of an alliance. A slow breath left Thomas's body as he absorbed the weight of her words. Everything inside him screamed against the idea. Vulnerability was not something he was accustomed to, not something he had ever willingly allowed anyone. Giving anyone the power to harm him, even symbolically, was something he had spent his life avoiding. Yet, as he looked at Myra, standing there with the blade in her hand, her expression unreadable but steady, he realized she was making the same choice. All right, he said finally, his voice low but steady, the words tasting like iron on his tongue. Let's do this. Myra nodded, her face unreadable. She handed him the second blade, her fingers brushing his for a moment. Then, without another word, she motioned for him to take his place. Stand here, she instructed, gesturing to the center of the room. Thomas did as she asked, his heart pounding as he gripped the dagger tightly in his hand. Myra stood before him, her eyes locked onto his with a steady intensity. On my signal, she said, her voice calm and measured. We will strike. Thomas nodded, his mind whirling as he tried to calm the storm inside him. He wasn't sure he was ready for this, wasn't sure he could go through with it. But he had no choice. He had come this far and there was no turning back. For a moment, everything was still. The world seemed to hold its breath as they stood facing each other, two people on the edge of something larger than either of them could understand. Then, as if guided by some unspoken rhythm, they moved. The blades flashed through the air, sharp and precise, cutting through the stillness of the room like thunder. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity, each motion deliberate, controlled, and yet filled with the kind of raw power that only vulnerability could provide. The air was thick with tension, and the room seemed to pulse with the shared energy between them. Thomas felt a sharp sting at the base of his throat as Myra's blade kissed his skin. His own blade had found its mark as well, a thin line of blue blood appearing on her neck. They froze, the intensity of the moment crackling between them, their breaths shallow and quick. Myra's eyes softened, her lips parting as if to speak. But no words came. Thomas swallowed hard, the gravity of what they had just shared settling over him like a weight. Now what? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Myra's gaze never wavered. Now, she said, lowering her blade, we see if the bond holds. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Thomas lowered his blade as well, his gaze never leaving hers. In that moment he realized the truth of the trial. The Sakara wasn't just testing their ability to work together. It was testing their ability to truly see each other, to trust what they found when they looked. The chamber remained cloaked in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the bioluminescent orbs lining the walls. Thomas and Myra stood motionless, their breaths slow but deep, the faint lines of blood on their necks already fading. He studied her face, his throat tight as he tried to make sense of the emotions swirling in his chest. Myra seemed to be weighing him, judging him as though she were seeing him for the first time. What's next? He asked quietly, his voice carrying more calm than he felt. Myra tilted her head slightly, a small curve of her lips betraying a faint smile. You truly are relentless, aren't you? She said, her voice soft but filled with something unspoken. I figure the sooner we get through this, the better, Thomas replied, his attempt at nonchalance undermined by the pounding of his heart. Her smile grew slightly, but there was a flicker of something vulnerable in her gaze, something unguarded. The third trial, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, is the trial of harmony. It is the most intimate of all. A test not of strength or endurance, but of connection. Thomas's eyebrows lifted slightly, his curiosity piqued. Connection? He asked. Myra nodded, stepping closer to him, her tone shifting to something warmer, more personal. The Sakara requires more than trust and cooperation. It demands balance. For two beings to share such a bond, they must align in ways that go beyond the surface. His chest tightened. He understood now. This wasn't just a trial of skills. It was a trial of their souls. The Sakara demanded everything and there was no turning back. How exactly do we test that? He asked, his voice thick with anticipation. Myra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned and began walking toward an adjoining doorway that Thomas hadn't noticed before. The air in the chamber seemed to grow warmer as she moved, the hum of the orbs growing louder, as though the trial itself were about to begin. Without hesitation, Thomas followed. Myra stepped forward, opening a door that revealed a smaller, more intimate chamber. The golden light that bathed the room was warm, casting long shadows on the walls and creating a sense of quiet serenity. It was a stark contrast to the larger, more imposing chambers they had passed through. The air seemed to hum with energy, thick with a sense of expectation. Myra glanced back to ensure Thomas was following, her movements deliberate, but there was something softer in the way she carried herself now. Thomas hesitated only for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had just endured the trial of vulnerability, and now he was being led into this new trial, the trial of attunement. As the door slid shut behind him with a soft whisper, he felt a shift in the air. The quiet hum of the chamber seemed to echo in his chest, his pulse quickening as the weight of the ritual pressed down on him. Myra turned to face him, and for the first time, he noticed a subtle vulnerability in her expression, a flicker of something that was both distant and near. The trial of harmony is about attunement, she said, her voice steady, but there was an undeniable note of something deeper, something personal, that made the air in the room thicken. It is not enough to merely work together. We must be in sync. Thomas nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. This was new territory for him, and he wasn't sure how to handle the unfamiliar weight of her words. He had faced physical trials before, but this was something entirely different. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability. The trust it required wasn't just physical, it was emotional and mental, an unspoken bond that went beyond the surface. Myra stepped closer, her green eyes softening as she met his gaze. This is not just about physicality, Thomas, she said, her voice low, and Thomas could hear the faintest tremor in it. It is about understanding. About listening to the unspoken and responding with intent. Do you understand? His mind raced, trying to process her words. I think so, he said, his voice quieter than usual. But you might have to guide me. A small smile tugged at Myra's lips, almost teasing in its nature. You adapt quickly. Let's see if that holds true. The moments that followed were like nothing Thomas had ever experienced. Myra moved with a fluid grace, an elegance that was both commanding and inviting, drawing him into her rhythm. She wasn't giving instructions in the way he expected. There were no clear commands, no explicit steps to follow. It was a dance, a fluid exchange of energy and intention that left Thomas trying to keep up, both physically and emotionally. Every movement, every glance, every soft touch from Myra felt deliberate. Her hands brushed against his, warm and certain, and Thomas felt a shiver of something new. There was a weight to her touch that carried a meaning beyond words, a meaning he was only beginning to understand. Do you feel that? Myra asked softly, her green eyes searching his with an intensity that took him by surprise. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the question hung in the air between them. I do, he replied, his voice barely audible, the words slipping out as if he were holding his breath. It's different? Myra nodded, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice rich with quiet satisfaction. Eller and bonds are different from human connections, she explained as if sharing something sacred, something important. They run deeper. They require complete surrender to the moment. Her words echoed in his mind, and for the first time Thomas understood. This wasn't just a trial. It wasn't just about proving he could work with Myra, or that they could cooperate in the face of danger. This was a test of their ability to let go, to surrender to each other, to become something greater than themselves for the sake of the bond they were forging. Can you do that, Thomas? Myra's voice dipped lower, almost teasing, but there was a challenge in it as well, a daring edge that made his heart race even faster. He met her gaze, his resolve hardening. Despite the growing tension in his chest, despite the vulnerability that wanted to paralyze him, he found his voice. I can, he said firmly, as if the words were a promise, something unshakable that he could hold on to. The trial unfolded in a way that defied easy explanation. There were no clear instructions, no steps to follow. It was a series of small moments, brief exchanges, quiet gestures, breaths shared in the stillness of the chamber. Myra's voice would occasionally break the silence, a soft murmur of approval or a word of encouragement, each one carrying a layer of meaning that Thomas had to listen for. The way her tone shifted, the subtle inflections in her voice, all of it was part of the rhythm they were creating together. It wasn't just about physical coordination, it was about understanding each other, responding to each other's presence with intent. "You surprise me, human," Myra said at one point, her voice barely audible, but her words carrying a weight of something deeper. "Your kind is not known for such responsiveness." Thomas allowed himself a small smile, though it was tempered with the intensity of the trial. "We're full of surprises," he said softly, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. But in that moment he realized it was true. He had surprised himself, surprised her. They had reached a level of attunement he hadn't thought possible. He wasn't just responding to her physically, he was responding to her energy, to the unspoken cues she was giving him. And she in turn was responding to him. As the trial reached its crescendo, the room seemed to hum with a strange, electric energy. Myra's movements slowed, becoming more deliberate, and Thomas found himself fully immersed in the rhythm they had created. His every movement, every breath, seemed to mirror hers. The connection between them felt tangible, almost as though it had taken form in the space between them, an invisible thread binding them together. Then as the tension built, Myra's voice broke the silence, low and breathless, carrying a note of awe. "Oh, human," she murmured, her tone filled with something deeper than he had heard before. "I've never felt this alignment before." Her words sent a thrill through Thomas, but he didn't let himself get lost in them. He remained focused, attuned to her every movement, every breath, knowing that the trial was nearly over. The connection they had created, that energy they had forged together, was something unbreakable. Something neither of them could have anticipated. Finally, as the energy in the room ebbed and settled, Myra let out a long, slow breath, her gaze locking with his. The intensity in her eyes was enough to make his chest tighten. "You've passed the trial of harmony," she said softly, her voice carrying both pride and something else, wonder perhaps or amazement. "Few have done so with such grace." Thomas nodded, the words a little lost on him as his mind tried to process everything that had just happened. His voice was subdued, almost humble as he responded. "It wasn't just me. We did this together." For the first time he saw something shift in Myra. Her expression softened and her eyes, those piercing green eyes, let their guard down completely. The walls she had built around herself, the fortress she had so carefully constructed, seemed to crumble just for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "We did." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, nor was it strained. Instead, it was filled with something else. Understanding, perhaps, or a quiet recognition of what they had just shared. The golden light in the chamber seemed to dim slightly as the trial came to a close, and Thomas and Myra stood together in the stillness, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. But as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. Myra turned abruptly, her posture stiffening, and the familiar hardness returned to her expression. "We should leave," she said, her voice snapping back to its usual clipped tone. "The council will be awaiting the results of this trial." Thomas hesitated, watching her as she crossed toward the doorway. He could see the subtle shift in her, how her movements had become just a bit more rigid, how the tension had crept back into her shoulders. Something had changed between them in that chamber, and though he didn't fully understand it, he knew she felt it too. "Myra," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" Her expression flickered for a moment, something unguarded crossing her face before the mask returned. She paused, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes momentarily meeting his. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability was gone. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, the walls back in place. "Let's go." Thomas wanted to press her, to ask what she wasn't saying, but he knew better. Myra was a fortress, and any attempt to breach her walls now would only make her retreat further. Instead, he followed her silently, his footsteps echoing in the corridor as they made their way back to the council chamber. The faint hum of the council chamber grew louder as they approached, and Thomas knew that whatever lay ahead would be far from easy. The council members were waiting, their silver eyes fixed on him and Myra as they entered the room. Councillor Vaughn was the first to speak, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. "The trial of harmony is complete, then?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "It is," Myra said, her voice steady but lacking the warmth she had shown earlier. "We succeeded." Vaughn's gaze shifted to Thomas, scrutinizing him with an intensity that made him feel as though his every move was being weighed and measured. "And the human performed adequately?" Vaughn asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Thomas resisted the urge to bristle at Vaughn's tone. Instead, he squared his shoulders and met the counselor's gaze head-on. "I'd say we did more than that," he replied evenly. "We worked together. We proved we're stronger as a team." Vaughn's lips curled into a faint sneer. "Strength is not measured by fleeting moments of cooperation," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "The true test of the Sakara?" The tension in the room thickened as Counselor Vaughn's cold voice sliced through the stillness. "Lies will shatter it," he intoned. "Speak only the truth." His eyes glinted with a predatory satisfaction, watching Thomas and Myra with a calculated intensity. Thomas felt the weight of the moment settle over him, as if the air itself had thickened and was pressing down on him with an oppressive force. The trial of truth was unlike anything he had anticipated, and he couldn't help but wonder what he was about to reveal. His gaze flicked to Myra, but her face was unreadable, a mask of calm that betrayed nothing of the storm raging within her. There was a slight tension in her posture, the way her hands were clenched at her sides, betraying her composed exterior. Myra, strong and unshakable, seemed to be on the verge of breaking, though she wouldn't allow it. Thomas saw her mask slip, even if only for a moment. Beneath the veneer of control he caught a flicker of something else, something raw, something human. The air was heavy with expectation, and Thomas could feel his own heart racing in his chest. He'd lived a life full of secrets, things he'd buried deep within himself, things he'd never shared with anyone. To lay them bare now, to expose them before this council, was a terrifying prospect. He had never thought of himself as someone who kept secrets for the sake of deception, but everyone had something hidden, something they were ashamed of, something they feared to expose. Myra's quiet words pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. "You don't want to do this," she said softly, her voice a mere whisper meant only for him. Thomas could hear the subtle plea in her tone, though she did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed forward towards the council, her expression cold and distant once again. It was as though she had retreated into herself, bracing for what was to come. Her hands trembled just slightly, her body stiff with tension. She had always appeared invincible in his eyes, but in this moment, he realized she was just as vulnerable as he was. Thomas met her eyes for a brief moment, willing her to understand that he wasn't about to let her face this alone. He wanted to comfort her, to assure her that whatever secrets they had, they would face this together. But the words stuck in his throat and instead he nodded. His voice when he spoke was steady but resolute. "I'll go first." He felt the shock of his own words as they left his mouth, surprising even himself. But there was no turning back now. As he stepped into the center of the glowing circle, he took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind. The pressure of the moment was almost unbearable. He scanned his memories, dredging up the moments that had shaped him, the things he had never told anyone. It wasn't easy. His mind rebelled, refusing to surface the darker, more vulnerable parts of himself. But he knew he had to speak, to offer up something that would allow the bond to be completed. Finally, he exhaled slowly and began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his confession. "When I was younger," he started, feeling the words spill from his lips as if they had been waiting to be spoken for years. "I almost left the diplomatic corps. I thought I wasn't good enough. I was afraid I'd fail, that I'd make things worse instead of better." He paused, his breath hitching for a moment as the memory played out before him. Those moments of doubt, the overwhelming pressure of living up to expectations. He had been terrified of not being able to measure up, of letting his father down. But the decision had been made. "But I stayed because I didn't want to disappoint my father. He always believed I could do this, that I could be better than what I thought of myself." As he spoke, the glowing circle beneath them pulsed brighter, its steady light seemingly affirming his honesty, providing some sense of validation. His chest tightened as the weight of his confession lifted slightly. It was a strange feeling to expose something so personal, but he couldn't help but feel a slight release. Maybe this trial wasn't just about breaking down barriers with others, it was about breaking down the walls within himself. He looked at Myra, expecting to see some reaction, but her expression remained unreadable. She was studying him closely, her green eyes sharp with an intensity that made his skin prickle. But instead of the usual steely gaze, he saw something softer, an understanding that seemed to pass between them, a wordless acknowledgement that they had both given something, shared a vulnerability. "My turn," she said quietly, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. She hesitated, her gaze briefly flicking towards him, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might refuse. But then with a quiet breath she spoke. "When I was chosen as an advisor to the council," she began, her voice carefully measured, each word chosen with deliberation, "I was proud. But I was also afraid." Her voice trembled just slightly on the word afraid, and it was enough to make Thomas's heart skip a beat. He had never heard Myra admit to fear. She was always so composed, so controlled. To hear her say it was like hearing a crack in her armor, a break in the fortress she had so carefully built around herself. "I feared that I would lose myself in the role," Myra continued, her voice a little steadier now. "That I would become nothing more than a pawn in the council's games. And I have." She let the words linger in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. It was as though she had laid bare something she had kept hidden for so long, her own struggle with identity, with purpose, with the cost of her position. The circle pulsed again, its light unwavering as it absorbed the truth of her words. Thomas was stunned. He had never imagined that Myra, the fierce, unyielding Myra, could be afraid. She had always seemed to have everything figured out, to know exactly where she was going, what she needed to do. But now, hearing this, he realized just how much weight she carried with her, how much of herself she had sacrificed in her pursuit of power. The walls she had built to protect herself, walls Thomas had once admired, were not as impenetrable as he had thought. "Why did you stay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the fragile truth they had shared. Myra's gaze locked with his, her green eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and sorrow. There was a long pause before she finally answered. "Because I thought I could change things from within," she said, her voice trembling just slightly, but her resolve still evident. "But I was wrong." The room fell silent as Myra's words hung in the air between them, raw and unflinching. Thomas could hear the weight of the unspoken pain in her voice, the regret that she had carried for so long. It was as though, in that moment, she had given him a piece of herself, something she had never shown anyone else. The truth of who she was, the vulnerability that lay beneath her stoic exterior, was laid bare. Counselor Vaughn stepped forward then, his silver eyes narrowing as he regarded both Thomas and Myra. "You have endured much," he said coldly, his voice stripped of any warmth. "But the Sakara demands one final trial, the trial of sacrifice." Thomas straightened, his muscles tensing instinctively. The room grew even colder as the weight of Vaughn's words settled over him. "What does it entail?" he asked, his voice steady, though a cold dread began to creep up his spine. Vaughn's lips curled into a cruel smile, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "One of you must relinquish something of great personal value," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "A piece of yourself. Only then will the bond be complete." Thomas exchanged a glance with Myra, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of unease in her green eyes. The tension in her jaw tightened, and he could see the calculating expression on her face as she weighed the options, considering the cost of what she might have to give. But before she could say anything, Thomas stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said firmly, surprising even himself with his resolve. Myra turned sharply to him, her voice sharp and laced with disbelief. "You don't even know what it involves," she snapped. "It doesn't matter," Thomas replied, his gaze steady. "If it secures the bond and this alliance, it's worth it." Vaughn raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Thomas's determination. He motioned to a small pedestal that had risen from the floor, holding a single glowing crystal. "Place your hand on the crystal," Vaughn instructed, "and focus on what you are willing to give. The Sakara will determine the rest." Thomas approached the pedestal, his heart pounding in his chest. The light from the crystal bathed the room in a soft, eerie glow, and he hesitated for only a moment before placing his hand on its cool surface. The moment his skin touched the crystal, it flared brightly, and a sudden wave of heat surged through him, pulling at something deep inside him, something primal. His mind swirled with visions. His family, his career, moments of triumph and failure, all flashing before his eyes in a kaleidoscope of memories. He felt the crystal tug at one particular memory, a warm summer day spent with his father. The words his father had spoken on that day, words of encouragement that had shaped his path as a diplomat, flashed before him with vivid clarity. The crystal pulsed and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He knew in that moment that the trial was far from over. What was being asked of him and of Myra was not just a test of strength or truth. It was a test of everything they held dear, of the very essence of who they were. Thomas's chest tightened as the crystal flared, its heat almost unbearable. His mind raced, caught between the memory and the decision that lay before him. The memory was one of his most cherished moments. His father's voice, calm and full of encouragement, echoing in his mind. It was a moment that had shaped his path, guided his steps through the complexities of diplomacy, and reminded him of why he did what he did. Letting go of that memory felt impossible. It wasn't just a piece of his past, it was a part of his very foundation, the emotional bedrock that had supported him for so many years. To relinquish it would create an empty space in his heart, a void where his father's voice used to be. The thought of losing it made his throat tighten, a lump forming there as he struggled with the weight of the decision. But then his gaze fell on Myra. Her eyes were fixed on him, unflinching and intense, the fire of determination still burning in them. Thomas knew deep down that this moment was about more than just the alliance or the trials. They had both been tested, broken down in ways they hadn't expected, and now it was about trust. It was about proving to Myra, to her people, that he was someone who could be relied upon. He wasn't just here to fulfill the requirements of a political alliance, he was here to prove that he could be the partner she and her people needed. That he could do more than just serve as a diplomat. His breath steadying, Thomas swallowed his hesitation. This was a sacrifice, but it was also a choice. His father had always told him that real growth came from letting go of things you held too tightly, things that kept you from moving forward. In this moment he understood what his father had meant. "I accept," he whispered, his voice barely audible. As the words left his lips, the crystal flared once more, brighter than before. A wave of heat surged through his chest, a searing pull that seemed to tug at the very core of him. But as quickly as it came, the heat subsided, leaving a hollow emptiness in its place, a strange aching void where his cherished memory had once been. He stepped back from the pedestal, his hand trembling slightly as he did so. But he didn't look away from Myra. Her voice, soft and filled with an unspoken tenderness, broke through the silence. "What did you give?" she asked, her tone almost reverential. There was a vulnerability in her voice that made his heart ache, a softness he had never heard before. "A memory," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Something important. But it was worth it?" Myra's expression shifted in a way Thomas couldn't quite place. Something between admiration and something deeper, something that was entirely her own. She stepped closer, her presence commanding and reassuring. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. "You didn't have to do this alone," she said, her voice laced with both gratitude and something else, something he couldn't name. "Yes, I did," he said with a faint smile, his gaze never leaving hers. "Because I knew you'd have done the same." The moment hung between them, fragile and intimate. Thomas could see the shift in her eyes, the acknowledgement of his sacrifice, the understanding that they had both given something of themselves. Myra seemed to soften in that instant, a crack in her typically unshakable armor, and Thomas felt a surge of warmth in his chest. It was the first time he felt as though the walls between them, both physical and emotional, were truly crumbling. Before either of them could say anything more, Vaughn's voice sliced through the moment, sharp and final. "The bond is complete. The Sakara has been fulfilled." The words echoed in the chamber, reverberating through the stone walls, but Thomas barely heard them. His focus remained entirely on Myra, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his pulse race. The trials were over, but the weight of what they had endured, what they had revealed to each other, was still fresh in his mind. It felt like the air around them crackled with the electricity of their connection. Something had shifted, something deep and irrevocable, and the bond they had formed felt more real than anything Thomas had ever known. The council chamber erupted in a low hum of approval from the members, their voices blending into an indistinct murmur, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to pay attention. His world had narrowed to just one thing: Myra. She met his gaze with a look that spoke volumes, a mixture of relief, understanding, and something even deeper, something that felt like an unspoken promise. She had always been strong, steadfast, but now, standing before him, she seemed different. They had both been broken down, had exposed parts of themselves they had never shared before, and in that raw vulnerability, something beautiful had been born. The chamber emptied slowly, leaving Thomas and Myra standing alone in the soft glow of the torches that lined the walls. The trials were over, the Sakara complete, but the air between them still vibrated with the intensity of what they had shared. Myra turned to him, her green eyes luminous, and for the first time, her expression softened, no longer the stoic, unyielding leader he had come to know. There was a warmth in her gaze now, something that spoke of trust and quiet intimacy, and it made Thomas's chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. "Come with me," she said, her voice low and inviting, her words carrying a weight that sent a thrill through him. She reached out, her fingers curling gently around his hand. Her grip was firm yet warm, and as she led him through the corridors of the council chambers, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of certainty. There was no hesitation in her movements, no doubt in her touch. She moved with purpose, with confidence, as though she knew exactly what she wanted. And in that moment so did Thomas. When they reached her quarters, Myra paused at the door. Her gaze locked with his, and for a brief, quiet moment, there was nothing but the intensity of the connection between them. "I've waited long enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No more barriers." The door slid shut behind them with a soft hiss, sealing them in the quiet of her private space. Before Thomas could respond, Myra stepped closer, her body pressing gently against his. Her hands brushed against his chest, sending a shiver down his spine, and she pushed him softly against the smooth wall of her quarters. His breath caught in his throat as her lips found his, soft and insistent. The kiss was unlike anything he had ever experienced, intense, consuming, and yet tender. It was as though every barrier between them was falling away with every passing second, as if the trials had done more than bond them. They had laid the foundation for something deeper, something impossible to ignore. Myra's hands moved to his shoulders, pulling him closer, and he responded in kind, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if she might slip away. "Myra," he murmured between kisses, his voice thick with emotion, a tangle of feelings he couldn't quite name. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her green irises glowing faintly in the low light. "Do you feel it, Thomas?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. "This connection, it's unlike anything I've known." He nodded, his breath catching in his chest as the full weight of her words hit him. "I feel it." Her lips curved into a smile, and before he could respond, she kissed him again, more deeply this time, as though they were both lost in the moment, in the intensity of the bond they had forged. Her hands moved to the fastening of his jacket, her fingers deftly undoing the buttons and sliding it from his shoulders. Thomas followed her lead, his hands moving to the shimmering fabric of her gown, undoing the fastening with a sense of urgency. The fabric fell away, revealing the smooth contours of her blue skin, and in that moment, all that mattered was the connection between them. Their breathing quickened, their movements growing more urgent, yet never losing their shared rhythm. Myra's fingers traced the lines of his body, exploring him with a mix of curiosity and possessiveness, as though she couldn't get enough of him. She leaned into him, her voice breathless as she whispered, "Oh human, I've never felt this completeness." Thomas's hands found her waist, his touch firm yet reverent. "You're incredible," he said, his voice raw with honesty. "I didn't think any of this was possible." She smiled against his lips, her breath warm against his skin. "Neither did I," she admitted, her tone carrying a hint of vulnerability. "But now I can't imagine anything else." The moments that followed were a blur of sensation and emotion, their connection deepening with every touch and whispered word. Myra's voice broke the quiet more than once, her expressions of pleasure unguarded and genuine. "Thomas," she murmured, her voice rich with satisfaction. "You're unlike anyone I've ever known. No Elarian could make me feel this way." He smiled, his forehead resting gently against hers. "You're not so bad yourself," he teased, earning a soft laugh from her. Their movements slowed eventually, their breathing steadying as they lay entwined in the soft light of the room. Myra's head rested on his chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his skin. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.